World News Today, brought to you by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas stations, as well as leading news centers of our own country, CBS correspondents are waiting to bring you a complete report from the world's political and battlefront. But first, here's Doug Edwards.
French forces on the island of Corsica are said to have captured the last German evacuation port of Bastia, while 3 Allied forces on the Italian mainland have all made new gains. The Red Army is smashing on toward the German base at Gomel, and 4 Russian spearheads are threatening the eastern border of White Russia. Allied planes are back over the continent in force today as the British observe the 3rd anniversary of their victory over the Luftwaffe. And in the Pacific, Australian troops are within 3/4 of a mile of the Jap base at Finschhafen, New Guinea. Now, Admiral Radio takes you direct to Algiers. John Daly reporting.
In the battle for the Italian mainland, the Fifth Army has driven another mile into the strongly held mountain positions of the enemy north and northeast of Salerno. Although progress has been slow immediately above Salerno, the right flank of the Fifth Army has made substantial gains. In the last 6 days, the American forces there have advanced 30 miles against stiff opposition and now hold an unbroken front along what are described as various key roads. The Fifth Army line is straightened out and runs about due east out of the hills overlooking Naples. Meanwhile, in eastern Italy, the British Eighth Army is likewise in sight of its objective. Racing up the Adriatic coast yesterday, the British forces reached the mouth of the Opanto River and entered the plain of Foggia. Netting gains of from 25 to 30 miles along its entire front and still meeting with no opposition, the Eighth drew into position to engulf the Foggia plain, which holds a vitally important system of airfields. The main airfield, just outside the city of Foggia, was an important civil and military aerodrome in times of peace. With it now are 12 satellite fields within a 20-mile radius of the city. The whole of Albania, Yugoslavia, and Greece are within close bombing distance from these fields, while Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Austria would be within easy reach of our heavy bombers. The Naples-Foggia line is a logical place for the Germans to make a determined stand. If they don't, it may mean a steady withdrawal to the Po Valley in the north, covered by the now familiar demolitions and skillful rearguard actions. A French communique, issued just a short while ago, speaks of steady pressure on the German forces contained in the northeast corner of Corsica. 3 new towns on the hills about 8 miles outside of Bastia have been occupied by French patriots and regular troops, and the road junction west of Bastia, which leads up into the Corsican finger, has been captured. The communique also reports sharp fighting in the district of Casamosa, 15 miles south of Bastia. Many prisoners were taken, and the Germans suffered severe losses. The Air Force yesterday struck another large feather in its cap by making the second 1,400-mile round trip this month to blast Bolzano, Bologna, and Verona in northern Italy. Both Bologna and Bolzano, which is only 30 miles from the Brenner Pass, are vital control points for rail traffic into Italy from Germany. Both took a heavy pounding from formations of our flying fortresses. The railway yards at Verona were also attacked, and bombs were dropped on a highway near Florence. About 24 enemy fighters attempted to intercept. 4 of them were shot down. There can be little doubt that their forces are stretched very thinly, since in heavy operations by our medium bombers and fighters in central Italy yesterday, only 4 enemy fighters were sighted, and one of these was destroyed. The Air Force also took a hand in the Corsica fighting. B-25 medium bombers struck at the Bastia Borgo airfield in Corsica, a blow at any German hopes of continued evacuation by air. Now back to CBS in New York.
More news in just a moment, but first here's Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
In the latter part of December 1942, a shock force of British regulars and native troops under Brigadier Wingate flashed out from India into the center of Jap-held Burma. The expedition was not a large one. There were no armored units, artillery, or supply trucks. But in its successful conclusion, radio, some of it perhaps Admiral equipment, played a vital role. Except for destroying enemy communications, the aim of this raid was largely experimental, to test the possibility of supplying such units entirely by air and to gain first-hand knowledge of jungle warfare. For almost 5 months, these raiders fought their way through dense, tangled jungles, over unbridged rivers, and through the rocky passes of the mountains of central Burma. over 1,200 miles covered entirely by foot. During this time, the sole means of communication with the outside world was by radio. Radio formed the link that kept a steady stream of plane-borne supplies flowing into their hands. The food, ammunition, medical supplies that are the lifeblood of military movements. The wartime duties of your peacetime admiral are dramatically illustrated by such cases as this. Though entirely devoted to war production now, to you on the home front, Admiral gives this assurance. The skill and effort now going into weapons of war will be yours when victory has been won in the new Admiral, America's Smart Set. And now, once again, here's Doug Edwards.
Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS London. Charles Collingwood reporting.
This is Battle of Britain Sunday over here. The British have a rather nice habit of setting aside a Sunday every now and then to give thanks for some great event of the war. And all over Britain today, in thousands of little churches, people came to thank God that the Battle of Britain had made it possible for them to be still in the war today. In London, it was a big church, and the King and Queen went to the great cathedral of St. Paul's and sang God Our Help in Ages Past and heard the Archbishop of Canterbury. But the most moving thing about this Battle of Britain Sunday is that all the people, all over the country, knew what that battle meant in terms of their lives and the lives of their children and the lives of the men who died, that it might be won. But the war goes on, of course, and with it all of the little things that we must look to if we want to know what the big things are. One such little thing that is being talked about in London is the new dispute between General Giraud and General de Gaulle. The French in London, most of whom it should be said are de Gaullists, are rather upset about the reports which have been coming out of Algiers. They are particularly upset about John Daly, a fellow CBS correspondent's story, and I report this as a matter of news interest. The story that de Gaulle feels that Giraud took unfair advantage of him in Corsica. The French here in London say that it isn't a Giraud-de Gaulle squabble at all, but rather that Giraud took certain decisions about Corsica on his own responsibility, and the French say that it is a French democratic tradition that generals should always be subordinate to the civil authority, in this case, the committee. So where the supporters of the French National Committee differ from Mr. Daly is that this controversy is not a matter of jealousy between Giraud and de Gaulle, but instead it is a question of principle involving the authority of the whole committee. I return you now to New York.
Allied planes from the Middle East Command continue to join the attack against Southern Europe amidst increasing reports of imminent new landings by our troops. For a direct account, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Cairo. James Fleming reporting.
The Allied operations in the Greek and Italian islands within the Aegean Sea are continuing. But again today, we have only the news of air activity to report. Yesterday, bullfighters of the Royal Air Force attacked an enemy destroyer that had run aground at Cape Cossinici on the southern tip of the island of Rhodes. The bullfighters scored cannon strikes on the vessel, starting small fires. The destroyer appeared to be badly damaged. On Friday night, the target was an aerodrome on Crete. RAF Hudson's and Baltimore's bombed the field at Castelli Periada in the interior of the island, causing fires. From these and other Allied operations in the Middle East, no Allied aircraft is missing. Some of the public pronouncements from the frightened collaborators in Hitler's satellite states are beginning to read like the memoirs of a tightrope walker. Here's the latest from Hungary. After the meeting of the Hungarian Prime Minister and Chief of Staff with Hitler, the cabinet held a meeting and issued a circular explaining what was called Hungary's position in the defense of Europe. The circular states that Hungary cannot play a positive part in case of an invasion of the Balkans because Hungary is not a Balkan state. Then it goes on to deny that Hungary has sent troops into the Balkans. Finally, in a kind of watered-down punchline, the statement concludes that Hungary is interested in the Balkans only as a neighbor. A nervous neighbor, they might have added. Even the Nazi-dominated Bulgarian army, on which Hitler is depending for occupation garrisons to replace Italians within the Balkans, begins to display a case of cold feet. It's reported that they've stopped at the Yugoslav border
and refused to cross the frontier into Albania, despite a strong German demand that they do so. For the Bulgars, the sight of strong Allied forces just across the Adriatic in Italy is just too discouraging. This is James Fleming in Cairo. I now return you to New York.
In this country, President Roosevelt has announced the appointment of a new Undersecretary of State. For this news and other developments on the home front, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Washington. Robert Lewis reporting.
President Roosevelt's appointment of Edward R. Stettinius, Jr. as the new Undersecretary of State and his establishment of a new Office of Foreign Economic Administration is being interpreted here as a move to bolster the State Department for the many post-war problems which already are developing on the international front. As Lend-Lease Administrator, Stettinius became acquainted at first hand with many of the problems confronting the various countries of the United Nations. And in both that capacity and in his former position as chairman of the board of the United States Steel Corporation, he was in a position to know his own country's needs and aims. In Congress, his confirmation seems assured. Both Democratic and Republican members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee have said that his appointment will be well received. And in announcing Stettinius' appointment, the president also revealed officially that Sumner Welles had resigned. In the consolidation of the various agencies dealing with foreign economic matters into the new Office of Foreign Economic Administration, the president named Leo T. Crawley as the administrator. He will be in complete charge of all operations, subject only to State Department direction and policy. Former Governor Herbert Lehman, who resigned simultaneously from his foreign relief and rehabilitation post, was appointed special assistant to the president. He is expected to work out the details of the forthcoming United Nations Relief Conference to be held here in Washington in November. And it's understood that Lehman will be this country's nominee for the chairmanship of that conference and its resulting Inter-Allied Commission. On the home front, the administration apparently has set the stage for another congressional battle over subsidies. The War Food Administration has announced a $100 million milk subsidy program, and it's understood that it's also preparing to ask for an extension and enlargement of the Commodity Credit Corporation. In the third war loan drive, the Treasury says now that we are within $1,695 million of the goal. This is Robert Lewis in Washington. Now back to CBS New York and Doug Edwards.
The Red Army's latest successes pose a great many problems for the German High Command. For a summary of these problems, here is Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott.
Today, the great military question regarding the Russian front is this: can the Germans hold on the line of the river Dnieper? At the moment, the Russians are engaged in mopping up the remnants of German resistance in the salient between fallen Smolensk and still resisting Gomel. They are hammering heavily at all the German bridgeheads on the left bank of the Dnieper, from Kiev down to Zaporozhye. None of these bridgeheads have fallen as yet, and so far there is no report that indicates that the Russians have anywhere crossed the Dnieper in force, though it is quite possible that patrols may have reached the western bank. West and southwest of Smolensk, the Russians are driving for the vital railway junctions of Vitebsk, strategic pivot of the German northern front, Orsha, main supply base for that front, and Mohilev. Farther south, Gomel is threatened, and below that, the Russians are in the eastern suburbs of Kiev itself. German resistance seems to be stiffening all along the southern part of the front. For example, the Russians have not yet reported the cutting of the Crimean Railway in the Melitopol area, though 3 days ago they were reported within 5 miles of the town of Melitopol. We must keep in mind the increasing difficulties of the Russians in the matter of supply. They have wrought veritable miracles so far in maintaining their advance so far from their railheads. They cannot do so indefinitely without a pause to enable their railway engineers to catch up with them and to reconstitute their forward depots. It may be that German resistance along the Dnieper will bring about the occasion, indeed the necessity, for that pause, but we do not know as yet whether that will be the case.
That was Major George Fielding Elliott. Standing by at a CBS microphone in Honolulu are 2 Navy men who played important parts in our recent attack on Japanese installations in the Gilbert Islands. For their stories, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Honolulu. Webley Edwards reporting. week ago, vigorous attacks by our carrier aircraft and land-based Army and Navy planes were made on the Japanese-held Gilbert Islands and Nauru. Just returned are Commander Leonard B. Sutherland of Fort Payne, Alabama, who commanded a carrier air group, and Lieutenant Commander Ernest M. Snowden of Beaufort, North Carolina, a dive bomber squadron commander. What was the purpose of the attack, Commander Sutherland?
Following the announced policy of hitting a Jap wherever he is, wherever possible, to do him the most damage, it was an attempt to neutralize these important bases. It was also excellent training for our men for a bigger job ahead.
How was it carried out?
The Army hit Tarawa with B-24s Friday night from midnight to around 4:30 with 25 tons of bombs. At the same time, other four-motor bombers, both Army and Navy of the same type, attacked Nauru with similar bomb tonnage. Next morning, our carrier bombers and fighters struck Tarawa. Some Jap fighters came up at Nauru, but none at Tarawa. However, we encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire. The fighters strafed the anti-aircraft positions and, together with the bombers, knocked out from 50 to 60%. Each bomber pilot was assigned a target on the first track. From then on until noon, they were reassigned primary targets. Or if these had been destroyed, any target of opportunity. They dropped 80 tons of bombs. My group alone used up 55,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. About mid-morning, I counted 9 Jap bombers burning on the ground, and 3 more counted later.
Your fighters were flying the new F-6F fighter, Commander.
Yes, but we had no chance to match them up with the Zero, for none came up at Tarawa until the Second Army attacked the day after we left. The net 18 Zeros evidently rushed in from the marshals, and the big bombers got 6 of them, while dropping 35 tons of bombs. The F-6F is a fast, rugged plane. My group had 40 planes shot up, but in the entire operation, only 4 planes, 2 dive bombers, a torpedo bomber, and a fighter were lost. None of the Army and Navy four-motor bombers were down. The damage to the Jap base was quite heavy, 45 or 50% destroyed.
What about the dive bombers, Lieutenant Commander Snowden?
I saw quite a few explosions and fire start up from our bombs. The fighters are everywhere, and the tracer bullets look like hoses pouring out red lead. When the dive bombers were diving and ran into clouds obscuring the targets, the pilots would pull out of the dive and make the run all over again, regardless of the heavy air fire. One fighter pilot came back with some palm leaves hanging on his gun. He was coming in low, got into some smoke, and when he came through it, there was another plane coming right at him. He swerved over, and his gun's gouged out the layers on the tree. One highlight was our last dive bomber attack. On the return, we looked back and saw some tremendous columns of smoke. I think the fire started from bombs that set off an ammunition dump.
Commander Sutherland, do you feel the Japs were caught napping?
No, I think that his large defense perimeter keeps him spread pretty thin. It looks like the Jap is going to have quite a bit of worrying about where to put his available fighter planes from now on.
Thank you, Commander Leonard B. Sutherland, Air Group Commander, Lieutenant Commander Ernest M. Snowden, Dive Bomber Squadron Commander, for this story of the Gilbert Islands attack. Good luck. This is Webley Edwards in Honolulu. I return you now to New York. At almost any hour, we may have word of another major success against the Japs on New Guinea. General MacArthur reports that Australian troops beating down bitter Jap resistance have moved within 3/4 of a mile of the enemy base at Finschhafen. And over on the Asiatic mainland, American medium bombers have again hit Jap installations in Burma. A communique from New Delhi tells of 4 buildings being destroyed in the Memao area east of Mandalay. Our bombers also attacked Japanese shipping in a sweep of the upper Irrawaddy River, and they scored a direct hit on 1 large ship. Here in our New York studio, wearing the uniform of an American war correspondent, is Robert P. Martin, just returned from Chongqing. He's been 5.5 years in the Far East, most of it covering the battlefront and events in the capital of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's government. We've been reading and hearing a lot the past couple of weeks of an impending offensive under Lord Louis Mountbatten to reconquer Burma as a step in carrying the war to Japan's homeland. Tell us, Mr. Martin, what, from your first-hand knowledge, are the prospects?
General Marshall's recent statement that the Allies are getting into position to launch a big attack against the Japs in the China-Burma theater was one of the most cheering statements the Chinese have heard in their long struggle. To them, the reopening of Burma has long been a mirage in the desert of this global war, always tantalizingly present, but always just out of reach.
Are the Chinese convinced that if we reopen Burma, we can start hitting the Japs in their home islands?
It isn't quite as easy as that. A reconquest of Burma doesn't mean that China would at once be turned into a great base for operations against Japan. Chinese leaders with whom I have talked admit that the Burma Road's former capacity of from 12 to 15,000 tons of freight a month in good weather can't be more than tripled, even under strict military control. And 45,000 tons a month certainly will not equip and maintain China's army. It will take American naval victories to do that. We'll have to reopen one or more Chinese ports.
Well, from what you say, Mr. Martin, maybe an offensive to reopen Burma wouldn't be worth the cost. Is that true?
Oh, no. Its benefits would be enormous. For instance, it would facilitate the movement of supplies to General Chennault's 14th Air Force, also to Chinese troops defending Chennault's air bases. Furthermore, China would obtain machinery for her almost worn-out war factories.
Well, then I take it that the Second Battle of Burma will be essentially a battle of supply.
That's it, exactly. And before we open up Burma, the Allies, the British, the Chinese, the Indians, and ourselves, will have to go through a lot of tough fighting. Our American and British bombers, despite the monsoon, have been constantly hammering the Jap lines of communication and Jap supply bases. It's true that our own lines of communication are not being subjected to this sort of pressure. But you must remember that it is more than 15,000 miles from the American assembly lines to the Burma front. Last week, I flew from Chongqing to the United States in 6.5 days. But only the most urgent personnel and supplies, and only limited quantities of them, can cover the distance at that speed. The rest, the bulk of our aid, goes by slow freighter. And sometimes, under the pressure of demands from other fronts in this global war, those freighters aren't available immediately.
Most of us know that Burma is a pretty tough spot for waging war, but I wonder if we realize just how tough it really is.
Well, Mr. Edwards, I recently visited the battle areas on both the Burma-India and the Burma-China frontiers, and I can tell you this. You can let your imagination run wild, and you probably won't be exaggerating. The main lines of communication are mountain trails worn deep through the century by plotting natives. These trails run through steamy, malaria-infested jungles. Tremendous mountains rear up on all sides. Travel isn't reckoned in miles, but in hours or days. Water and food are at a premium. But the Chinese have proved in these past few months, as have Brigadier Wingate's British jungle fighters, that the Japs can be beaten in Burma. They can be beaten in Burma just as they have been beaten in the jungles of New Guinea.
I'm sure they can, and I'm sure they will be, and thank you very much, Robert P. Martin. And now, once again, here is Warren Sweeney with a message from our sponsor.
Not only on the battlefield is radio demonstrating its vital usefulness in this war, there is an equally important part being played guarding our shores here at home. So essential has radio proved itself in the operation of the Civil Air Patrol that many states have conducted special drives for funds to provide patrol planes with two-way radio equipment. For example, a special appropriation was recently made by the General Assembly of the State of Virginia for this very purpose. With the facilities of the Admiral plants entirely devoted to building such instruments, make it a part of your home front duties to conserve your radio, which has now become irreplaceable. Call your Admiral dealer in case of emergency, and be assured that he will do everything in his power to keep your set in working order. After the war, Admiral, in peacetime the world's largest manufacturer of radio phonograph combinations with automatic record changers, will bring you the new Admiral, America's Smart Set.
Attention, men and women of Chicago. Your country needs you. Help build vital communication equipment for our frontline fighters at the great Admiral plants in Chicago. The work is easy and interesting. No experience is necessary, and you'll be paid while learning. The factories are modern with the latest type machinery, as well as company cafeterias for your convenience. Simply go to the employment office of the Admiral plant at 4150 North Knox Avenue by taking a Montrose streetcar to 4600 West. Or take the Armitage Avenue car to the Admiral plant at 3815 Armitage Avenue. Get into radio now, the modern business with a great future. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when the Continental Radio and Television Corporation again brings you World News Today, direct from the leading news centers of the world. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System. You're listening to the WWII Theater, Wrigley Building, Chicago.
World News Today, brought to you by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas stations, as well as leading news centers of our own country, CBS correspondents are waiting to bring you a complete report from the world's political and battlefront. But first, here's Doug Edwards.
The Germans have launched a sea and airborne attack today against the Dodecanese island of Kos, which was recently occupied by the British. Allied Fifth Army troops on the Italian mainland have captured Benevento, northeast of Naples, while the British Eighth Army, striking swiftly up the Adriatic side, has lopped off a wide area. The Royal Air Force bombed Munich again last night, and Berlin reports that German troops in South Russia have evacuated the town of Taman on the peninsula directly across the Kiev Strait from the Crimea. For our first news direct from overseas, Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS Algiers. Winston Burdett reporting. All along the Italian front, from Naples across the Apennine Mountains to the Adriatic coast, the Germans are fighting bitter rearguard actions against the Allied advance. The fall of Naples really marked a stage in the battle. Both sides are now regrouping for another major clash. Once again, the vital sector is on our left flank on the coast. But instead of mountains this time, we have a clear plain stretching 25 miles northward, where both we and the Germans can throw in heavy armored forces. French and Patriot troops have all but ousted the Germans from Corsica. French headquarters this afternoon announced that Moroccan sharpshooters have driven the Germans off Cagina Hill, just 4 miles outside of Bastia. Further north, a small party of American Rangers have struck through to the coast. The result is that the Germans now hold a dangerously narrow 30-mile strip north and south of Bastia. They are pulling out in a hurry, both from the port and from the beaches. Behind the military news of the past week, there has been one development that is worth remarking on: the political reorganization that has been taking place in Corsica. The Corsican resistance movement, which opened the fight against the Germans, have recognized the authority of the French Committee of National Liberation in Algiers. The new prefect or governor named by the committee has approved virtually all the popular elections held throughout Corsica when the organized patriot drive against the Germans began. The Corsicans have now set up a new committee, a purification committee, it is called, to deal with Corsican officials and others who have collaborated with the enemy. This committee began its work today. All charges must be laid before it by the 1st of next month. It will complete its report by November 10th, and the accused will then stand trial for war crimes. These developments in Corsica are significant because they foreshadow what may one day happen in France itself. The French Commissioner of the Interior, André Philippe, who is responsible for coordinating French resistance movements, told correspondents here yesterday that he expected to see the same sort of process in France when France is liberated. The same preparedness, the same quick popular reaction, and the same general pattern of cooperation between the French National Committee and the people in France who have been organizing to resist the enemy. How strong those people are, we don't know, but they are a force, a political force for the future. A hint of their numbers was given in an official French statement today. It said that since mid-July, 54,000 young Frenchmen have escaped deportation to Germany and have joined the 150,000 who already are hiding out in the French Alps and the Pyrenees. They are going to have a rough winter, but someday they will come back. I return you now to New York. More news in just a moment, but first here's Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
A flying fortress formation recently returning from a bombing mission over France was attacked by a swarm of Volk-Volks. One fort, an engine knocked out, lurched out of control, leveled off, and began to fall behind. Immediately, 8 enemy planes roared in for the kill. High above, a Thunderbolt pilot saw the action. Over the radio, an Admiral-built radio perhaps, flashed the command, "Follow me, I'm going to help that fort below." 4 American fighter planes peeled off into screaming dives, ripped into the Nazis, scattered and drove them away from their intended victims. The fort was badly hurt. To halt its rapid loss of altitude, every movable object was ruthlessly thrown overboard, even guns and ammunition. During the long journey back, The 4 fighter planes covered their crippled mates like a protective umbrella. Then, as they finally approached the coast of England, radio again came into action, this time with a message to an emergency field clearing a runway for a crash landing. A landing that brought a priceless crew of American boys into safety. Here is another dramatic example of the part radio is playing in this war. Radio equipment now being turned out at top speed at the great Admiral plant. Though in wartime production now, Admiral is already planning for conversion to peacetime duties to the building of the new Admiral, America's smart set. Now, here once again is Doug Edwards.
Allied planes in Britain have carried out new night and day attacks against Germany and the enemy-occupied continent. For this news and to report on other developments, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS London. Larry Lasser reporting.
The young men of the United States 8th Army Air Force went over the top again today. In B-26 Marauder bombers, the Americans roared in low-level formations across the choppy North Sea. Escorted by Poles, Czechs, Belgians, Australians, and Englishmen in Spitfires, all the Americans returned safely after bombing 3 enemy airfields in Holland. 7 German fighters that attempted to interfere were shot down by the Spitfires. The young Americans who fly the big fortresses over Europe are immensely cheered to know that we've opened a second front in the air from the Mediterranean side. Heretofore, every fortress that flew over Germany was coming from only one place, and the Germans knew it. So they were able to concentrate their fighters facing England. Now that southern Germany has been bombed in daylight by American fortresses from Africa, the Germans will have to redistribute their fighter strength. I've just spent a day with the fortress flyers. They didn't go on operations that day. They just sat around, read the papers, and listened to the radio. In the afternoon, they received their pay, and the big poker game started. The fortress boys play poker the way they fly, swashbuckling and deadly. They peeled off pound notes, 5 and 10 at a time, to draw a single card, and they showed little emotion whether they won or lost. I saw very little sign of any mental strain among these young men who take their lives in their hands almost every week. Doctors on the airfield informed me that if an airman is going to crack under the strain, he's likely to show it during his first 5 rays. But the doctors believe that any anxiety neurosis among the fortress men is not caused by fighting enemy fighters in flak over Germany, but that latent neuroses are brought out by the tremendous strain. And even such cases are comparatively rare. However, I learned that almost no man can go through the strain of completing 25 fortress raids over Germany without showing some signs of mental wear and tear. I noticed that the boys do comparatively little drinking, except on party nights, and then they let themselves go. Their favorite beverage on party nights is a form of punch. For those who may be interested, it's compounded of grapefruit juice, pineapple juice, and plenty of Jamaica rum. For understandable reasons, it's called a flying fortress. We return you now to New York and Doug Edwards.
The eastern Mediterranean is back in the news again today. German forces are trying to win back an Italian island in the WWII taken by the British a short time ago. For the latest news on this development, Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS Cairo. James Fleming reporting.
Early this Sunday morning, the Germans launched an attack on the Allied-held island of Kos, the WWII. This effort by the enemy to regain control of this strategic Aegean island is described as a sea and airborne assault. The island of Kos is the 3rd largest in the WWII group. It lies close to the coastline of Turkey and is well behind the enemy's outer positions on Rhodes Street and Starpanto. In mid-September, we took over Kos, along with the islands of Leros and Samos. The Italians had been occupying these positions, and on the arrival of Allied forces after the armistice, they cooperated with us as co-belligerents. The fact that the Germans chose to go after Kos underlines the importance of air power in the defense of the Aegean, for Kos boasts one of the finest aircraft to be found in any of the islands. The Nazis have made several heavy raids against this aerodrome during the past few days. How strong the attacking German forces are, we do not yet know. The only announcement from Allied quarters thus far is the first reassuring phrase that necessary countermeasures have been taken. Lieutenant Harold Hare, an American fighter pilot formerly based in North Africa, is based in Cairo these days, recovering from 12 days of floating in the Mediterranean after bailing out during an encounter with some Messerschmitt fighters. Lieutenant Hare, who comes from North Dakota, floated around in one of those inflated rescue dinghies, often within sight of Allied ships, but day after day unable to signal his presence to them. Then for the last 5 days, he was within sight of the North African shore, but the strong currents and his own weakened condition made it impossible for him to row into land. He lived on the meat of a turtle, not very good, he says, some small birds, and one canteen of water. In the last stages of exhaustion, he was finally picked up by an Australian corvette. He's okay now, getting plenty of rest, making a good recovery here in Cairo. His is just one of thousands of stories of American courage and endurance. It's a good idea now and then to remind ourselves that the real sacrifices are made not back at the lines at home, but at the front. This is James Fleming in Cairo. I now return you to New York and Doug Edwards.
The French National Committee is reported about to enter discussions on the status of French prisoners in Spain. For a direct report from Spain and a summary of the news filtering into that country, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Madrid. Glenn Stadler reporting.
Reports from...
We regret the interruption of our broadcast from Madrid. But now, for a summary of the battlefield situation in Italy, here is Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott.
The capture of Benevento by the Fifth Army, in effect, turns the line of the Volturno River, on which speculation had centered as a possible next stand by the retreating Germans. Meanwhile, the Eighth Army continues its swift advance up the east coast of the Italian peninsula. Its reported position is due north of Benevento. There is a distinct possibility that its advanced elements are much farther up the coast, perhaps as far as a point opposite Rome. Thus, dramatically and swiftly is developing the situation which had been foreseen. Thus are the Germans being presented with a growing bill of account for having taken the terrific risk of fighting in southern Italy at all. There is now some prospect, to put it conservatively, that the German troops which fought at Salerno and before Naples may be cut off altogether and surrounded with their backs against the sea somewhere between Naples and Rome. This prospect is increased by the heavy bombing of communications in their rear and by the progress being made in the reduction of the last German foothold on Corsica. On that island, French-Moroccan troops have taken a hill which the communique terms the key to Bastia. From Corsican bases, the road to the Italian peninsula can be bombed at ranges under 100 miles. It would seem certain that the Germans must now choose between a race for the shelter of the northern mountains and the putting in the peninsula of Italy of yet more troops to stem the Eighth Army's advance before that army can cut westward and chop off the line of retreat of von Kesselring's forces from Naples. Any German attempt to stand south of Rome or at Rome takes on more and more of a suicidal character as the situation unfolds.
That was Major George Fielding Elliott. In this country, the food and manpower problems are still getting major attention. For a report on the latest developments and an interview with one of our naval heroes, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Washington. Robert Lewis reporting.
The heads of 3 economic agencies, in a statement summarizing government efforts to control the threat of inflation, report that the battle is being won, but that the real fight is still ahead. The War Food Administration, in its continuing efforts to increase the food supplies of the nation, tomorrow will start unveiling its 1944 crop production goals. Representatives of the agency will begin conferences with state leaders throughout the country, explaining to them the scope of the program. The goals, as set up, would give the nation a slightly larger supply of food than it produced this year. And tomorrow, the Supreme Court of the United States begins its 153rd year. In Congress, Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau is scheduled to present his new tax program. He's expected to call for an additional $10 billion in federal excises. Tomorrow also, the Senate will resume debate of the father draft question. Latest developments in that field come from Draft Director Hershey, who suggested that more efficient use could be made of men now classified as 4F. The Navy Department reports in a communique this afternoon that a lone American reconnaissance plane flying over the Japanese-held island of Nauru in the Central Pacific beat off 9 attacking Zeros, shooting down one of them. And every American knows the legend of the battleship X and her famous commander, Rear Admiral Thomas Lee Gatch, who did so much to turn the tide of battle in the South Pacific just a year ago this month. Newly commissioned, fresh from her trial runs, this 35,000-ton battle wagon sailed into the Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26th and into the same murderous kind of Japanese torpedo plane attack which killed the Prince of Wales in repulse. But the X, maneuvering at better than 27 knots, shot down 32 enemy dive bombers with a hail of steel so awesome that the commander of American aircraft signaled his men away. He yelled, "Stay away from that big bastard. She's shooting down the sky." Admiral, then Captain Gatch, was badly wounded during that encounter. But 3 weeks later, he took the X into Windy Gulch off Salvo Island, where in a weird and deadly night engagement, 5 Japanese warships were sunk. Previously, this ship was known simply as the X, to hide her secrets of armament and greatly increased firepower. But now the Navy has revealed her as the USS South Dakota. Today, her skipper, during those historic engagements, is here to tell you of the ship he proudly calls the greatest in the world, Rear Admiral Thomas Lee Gatch.
That's exactly my opinion. The South Dakota is the greatest in the world, including the much-vaunted Admiral Tirpitz. And I'd like to say something about her. She was built by the New York Shipbuilding Corporation in Camden, New Jersey. She was commissioned in March 1942, but didn't get to sea until June because it takes a long time to finish a battleship's turrets. But from the minute we hit salt water, those of us who knew a ship knew that this one was perfect. She ran as quietly and efficiently as a sewing machine. Every one of the crew loved her. This enthusiasm continued throughout the grueling weeks of trial runs and fire practices. You know, in peacetime, it takes a year for a new crew to learn to handle a ship in battle, but we did it a lot faster. My navigator said I kept saying, "That's the rottenest shooting I've ever seen," and sometimes I'd just grunt. But 2 days before we got into battle, I conceded that the shooting was pretty good.
Well, that sounds like a masterly understatement, Admiral. And that kind of shooting changed the opinion of some so-called experts about the value of the battleship, didn't it?
I hope it gave them something to think about. I think the first action, when the Japs tried to relieve Guadalcanal by superior air power in the daytime, proved that the battleship, with proper air coordination, rules the seas. And the Salvo Island fight, with the Air Force out of it, demonstrated that there is no match for the battleship except equally good battleships. I rather think the battleship is here to stay.
Well, what about the Japanese battleships, Admiral?
The Japanese build good ships, but every time we've met them on anything like equal terms, they've been overwhelmingly defeated. I think we will keep on doing it.
Well, I'm sure that America shares that confidence, Admiral Gatch, thanks to you, your officers and men of the USS South Dakota, formerly the Battleship X. And this is Robert Lewis in Washington. Now back to CBS New York and Doug Edwards.
Allied troops have chalked up another victory against the Japs in the Southwest Pacific. For this news and other developments in the Pacific, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Honolulu, Webley Edwards reporting.
The most important immediate objectives of the United States forces in the Pacific are the Marshall and Carolines Islands. The most direct route to Tokyo is not through New Britain and the islands infested by the Japs in the Southwest Pacific. If our forces must approach the Japanese inner domain via the island-hopping route, slowly and laboriously conquering island by island, the war would last for more years than we like to think about, and must hit more directly at the Japs through the Marshalls and Carolines, and this we will do when the Pacific timetable calls for it. We must provoke a major sea battle with the Jap and destroy or cripple his fleet. This is the gist of conversations I have had with men here at Pearl Harbor who've been fighting the Jap for nearly 22 months now. To these men, the fall of Finchhaven in New Guinea, which has just been announced, is good news. For its fall continues to put pressure on the Japs' outer perimeter of defense in that area. Plus, its pressure is being put on the Japs from the Aleutians and from recent air attacks on Marcus and Gilbert Island. All of these tend to keep the Jap defenses spread as thin as possible. Finchhaven's fall puts the Allies in control of all the area leading to Rabaul on New Britain from the west and the south. The slow push of the Americans up from the Solomons is opening the way to Rabaul from the south and east. There is, however, some evidence that Rabaul is no longer the mighty Jap base it once was, that the Japs have pulled some of their strength back from Rabaul to their inner domains. The drive toward the Marshall and Caroline Islands has been a necessity of the Pacific campaign from the outset. To most of us who follow this Pacific War, it has been something that was far, far over the horizon, in some happy day to come. That happy day is much closer than we had dared hope for. There are strong indications that the might of the Pacific Fleet is aimed at the heart of the Jap defenses rather than to the outer fringes of the defense perimeters. The nearer that time approaches, the less talk you can get from Navy leaders here. Right now, they are saying nothing, which experience shows is a good sign out here. When you're ready for heavy action, you don't have to do much talking about it. There are many warships and planes now on hand in the Pacific to do the talking. This is Webley Edwards at Pearl Harbor. I return you now to New York.
An item from the Far East. American planes based in China have carried out one of their biggest attacks to date. Our liberators have blasted the Jap base at Haiphong in Indochina. We set fire to the power plant, warehouses, and dock installations with more than 50 tons of explosives. Jap interceptors came after our big bombers, but they didn't do so well. We shot down 30 Zeros, probably destroyed another 14, and damaged 5. In spite of the fierce battle, only 6 of our liberators were damaged. Escorting P-40s and P-38s were undamaged. On the Russian front, Radio Berlin this morning broadcast a communique announcing a new withdrawal. Taman, on the peninsula directly across the Kiev Strait from the Crimea, is now said to have been evacuated. No word from Moscow yet, but the latest Russian communique told of the capture of 2 important towns east of Taman. The German evacuation of Taman means that the defeated Nazi armies of the Caucasus, the troops that once held great areas and stubbornly defended their Kuban bridgehead against Soviet offensives, are finally being driven out of the Crimea. Nazi propaganda minister Goebbels today let the German people on what's in store for those who attempt to undermine the belief in victory. Goebbels said the Reich is prepared to cut off the heads of those persons. He bitterly criticized Germans on the home front who, he said, by their loss of faith, are stabbing soldiers in the back. And now, once again, here is Warren Sweeney with a message from our sponsor.
Salt is a deadly enemy of metal. Those of you who live near the ocean have seen the license plates on your car rust. The plated steel decorations turn to a discolored red because of the destructive action of salt water. In building seagoing radio equipment, the corrosive action of salt is a problem of major importance. Admiral-built instruments now going to our armed forces are pre-tested to meet this challenge. In an airtight cabinet, known to Admiral engineers as a salt chamber, parts going into such radios are sprayed under pressure by a highly saturated salt solution. This treatment continues not for minutes or even hours, but literally for days. Though completely encrusted with salt when finally removed, these delicate parts must still meet Admiral's exacting standards of performance. Here is one of many thorough tests Admiral equipment must pass before being accepted for seagoing duty. Tests that assure rugged dependability wherever Admiral equipment may serve on our many fighting fronts.
Attention, men and women of Chicago. Your country needs you. Help build vital communication equipment for our frontline fighters at the great Admiral plants in Chicago. The work is easy and interesting. No experience is necessary, and you'll be paid while learning. The factories are modern with the latest type machinery as well as company cafeterias for your convenience. Simply go to the employment office of the Admiral plant at 4150 North Knox Avenue by taking a Montrose streetcar to 4600 West. or take the Armitage Avenue car to the Admiral plant at 3815 Armitage. Get into radio now, the modern business with a great future. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave, direct from the leading news centers of the world. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
The WBBM Air Theater, Wrigley Building, Chicago.